Everybody, welcome back to Aviation Law, the governance of global aviation. Now, as I was actually saying, that in the governance of global aviation, it is facilitated through the International Civil Aviation Organization. And the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, came into existence in 1944 by what is called the signing of the Chicago Convention. So in 1944, a group of nation states with aviation interests came together in Chicago, Illinois, United States, and agreed that they would abide by a set of universal standards and recommended practices. Now, to best understand ICAO, it is good to go back prior to ICAO and realize what was happening in the aviation industry at the time. So prior to the formation of ICAO, each nation state was developing their own aviation industry, and they all had their own form or version of standard and recommended practices. So for instance, in Japan, the standards and practices there were different from the standards and practices, let's say, in Germany, which were different from the standards and practices in the United States. And what started to happen when aircraft start to fly and cross international boundaries? Yes, there start to be conflict in terms of those standards and practices. And those conflicts create hazards, and those hazards has big risks. So to eliminate those risks, that's how ICAO came into existence in terms of abiding by set of standards and recommended practices. Now, if you look at ICAO today, ICAO has a lot of documentation, a lot. You can't read it off. No matter how well you can read, can't read it off. A lot of documentation. But the core of ICAO, central to ICAO, yes, it is what is called the ICAO Annexes. And there are 19 annexes, starting from Annex 1, has to do with personal licensing, all the way through to Annex 19, that has to do with safety management systems. Now, I'm going to walk through each one of these annexes in a summary format, and I am going to take the example of Albert Einstein, because Albert Einstein, I respect him as one of the brightest minds. And this is what he said: if you have a theory or a concept, no matter what, integration, differentiation, the mathematics that put the satellite up in the space and park it over the earth, yes, if you have a concept, or even Einstein theory of relativity, if you have a concept and you cannot explain that concept in a way that is understandable to a 6-year-old, it possible is that you may not understand that concept yourself. So I think I understand aviation law. I know I understand aviation law. So I'm going to summarize it in a format where the layman, the 6-year-old, can understand it according to Albert Einstein. So we're going to run through the annexes, starting from Annex 1. So Annex 1 has to do with personal licensing of personnel in aviation. So we talk about like the pilots and air traffic controllers and air traffic engineers and aerospace engineers. And the thing is this, when they come on to personal licensing, what ICAO want is that everybody across the board in terms of international operation is trained up to the same standard. So if you look at one of the ICAO syllabus for instance, a pilot, there's normally academic exams to be passed, and it's pretty much the same. There's normally on-the-job training to be done. It's pretty much the same for everybody around the world. And there is normally a medical exam to be passed. Pretty much the same for everybody. So for instance, the airline pilot that is flying the Dreamliner or the Boeing 777 from Japan to New York, his license, yes, is pretty much the same as the pilot in New York, American pilot flying from New York to Japan. There is no difference because both have to walk through the same process. It is the same for air traffic controller, air traffic engineers, and such alike. So when it come on to personal licensing, there is a particular standard, and these individuals, irrespective of your discipline that you exercise in, must pass these exams. So, for instance, you do not want a pilot to, be experienced in terms of his on-the-job training, and he's really bright in terms of passing his academic exams, but he failed his medical. In aviation, listen to me, there is no greater wealth than good health. You don't want a pilot to be flying a Airbus 380 with 500 passengers on board, taking them on their vacation. And when he reach final on the airport, oh my gosh, he's not able to see the runways. Like, oh, first officer, is that the runway? No, captain, that is the highway. What about that one? Absolutely not. There's no playing around, because that could be the last flight for those persons going on their vacations. We don't want that. So there is standard when it comes on to personal licensing. Annex 2 talk about rules of the air. Rules of the air. And just like how we operate on the road, driving our cars, going around the roundabout, who have the right of way, stoplight, the similar thing happens in terms of the sky. I should tell you that there is this expression that the sky is the limit. There is no limit to the sky. When it comes on to flying airplanes in the sky, there are limits and there are rules of the air. And if you mess up those rules, a lot of dead people. All right, so strict adherence to those rules in terms of rules of the air. Some of the rules that we have like the visual flight rules, where persons fly the plane and they look out through the window with visual reference to the ground in terms of keeping the plane level and where they're going and what they're doing. And then we have different rules such as instrument flight rules. So these are the planes that fly through clouds and bad weather. Have you been on a flight and you look outside and you can't see anything and you wonder how the pilot make his way? Because the pilot doesn't need to see outside, but he's looking at his instruments to keep that plane level and in terms of where he's going. So in terms of how you go about the rules of the air, in terms of, yes, and all of that is embedded in the license. Annex 3 talk about meteorological services for international air navigation. And this is very, very important because sometimes we have some long flights, so 10-hour flights, 14-hour flights, you name it. And a pilot may plan his flight, for instance, from Sydney to London. And according to the weather, when he was leaving Sydney, it is clear, calm wind, everything beautiful in London. And halfway through his flight, believe you me, what's happening? It's snowing, zero visibility. That pilot maybe have to plan and go to an alternate. So all of this meteorological information is very, very essential in international civil aviation. And it's pretty much part of the law in terms of how the system operates. Annex 4 talk about aeronautical charts, and earlier I talked about the rules of the air in terms of IFR rules, aeronautical charts. So there are standard charts that persons use. So for instance, a pilot leaving from China, operating in a different part of the world, such as Jamaica, the charts are pretty much the same and standard. So when he gets there, or when he's going there, or when the air traffic controllers are talking about certain things on the chart, irrespective of where you're coming from, yes, there's a connection. They can relate. Aeronautical charts. Annex 5 talk about units of measurement to be used in air and ground navigation. Now, this is part of the process in terms of standards and recommended practices, because in terms of units of measurement, come on, we don't use, for instance, we have the liter, American liter, the English liter, and they're pretty much, no difference. When we say one thing, it must mean one thing. So for instance, in aviation, let's take, for example, time. We do not want to have two aircraft, yes, within the same space at the same time flying around, because that is just going to end up as a ball of fire. So if we take, for instance, time, we have British time, we have Australian time, New York time, but in aviation, there's only one time. One time. So if you go to Gatwick Airport and you look at the air traffic control clock, it is pretty much the same time as the clock in the control tower in Tokyo, and there's the same thing in Kingston and everywhere. And we call this universal coordinated time. And the pilots in their aircraft has the same time as well. So there is no confusion. When we say this time, it means what it says, universal coordinated time. And a similar fashion a traverse or follow through when it comes on to other systems of measurement. Annex 6 talk about operation of aircraft. Now, you know, that in of itself is self-explanatory, but we have all different type of machines that fly around, and we want to ensure that whosoever operating those machines, yes, there is standards in terms of how they go about operating it, and also in terms of persons who operate on the ground facilitation, they pretty much know how to relate. So in terms of operation of aircraft, there is a standard touching on that. There is a book, I'm going to publish a book on aviation law, so I will put in all the technical expressions on all the long writings, but right now, as I said, it's a summary. Annex 7 talk about aircraft nationality and registration marks. Now, just like the cars on the road, you know, wherever you go, registration plates, aircraft has registration numbers as well. So take, for instance, all the civilian aircraft in the United States begin with the registration letter N, November. If you see an aircraft with N on it, it is registered beginning with the letter N. It is registered in the United States. In the United Kingdom, all aircraft registered in the United Kingdom begin with the letter G. I don't know what G stands for. Maybe it stands for great or something of the sort. But and this is the same thing, whether it be China or whichever country. The rules are different when they come on to military aircraft. We all know already how military operate. They're always on the disguise, on the camouflage, so we don't know who is bad from who. Yes, so, but for civilian aircraft, there is a standard in terms of registration, and there is national registry that each and every one go by in terms of the law. Annex 8 talk about airworthiness of aircraft. That is self-explanatory as well. We talk about the roadworthiness of a car. So an aircraft has to be airworthy. It has to be fit to fly. So pretty much have those inspectors who go around, and from time to time they check the tires, how much landing has taken place in terms of the engines, a lot of stuff. So it has to be airworthy. You don't want to put someone on you know, American Airlines or British 777, you know, flying them across the ocean, and pretty much it has not been properly maintained and airworthy. You know, you're across the ocean and something start to wobble, the tail start to, no, we don't want that. Annex 9 talk about facilitation. Facilitation is pretty much, it's a broad area, but we can condense it. So for instance, at the aerodrome, as to whether there are jet bridges, for some aerodromes, for instance, I was working at one aerodrome at one particular point in time, there was no jet bridge. So when persons hop off their you know, off their first class flight, they would step off on a step onto the apron. And if it was raining, yes, your fancy Gucci suit, yes, and you hardly get a skin handbag would get wet in the rain, you know. It's like, oh God, don't you see I'm wearing my Gucci suit today? What sort of thing is this? I may just become an atheist. Anyway, the bottom line is this. So when it comes on to like fueling and all these things, they are pretty much standards when it comes on to facilitation. One other thing that is not talked about much is also customs and immigration. Yes, so pretty much these things are standardized in terms of how we deal with it, deportees and all these sort of things. So Annex 10 talk about aeronautical telecommunications. And these are the unsung heroes in aviation. Most of the time, these are the humble guys. They are not as puffed up and full of ego like air traffic controllers. Okay, I shouldn't say that. The air traffic controllers are going to crucify me. I'm just talking about myself, all right? Not talking about other air traffic controllers, talking about myself, you know, flying around like a Chinese balloon. But the aeronautical engineers, they are the persons that are responsible for communication, navigation, and surveillance equipment. So like, for instance, the radios work well. Pilots can hear us. We can hear the air traffic controllers can hear the pilots. Navigation, such as landing aids, we talk about VOR in terms of telling where you are in the sky in terms of angles, DME, you know, in terms of measuring your distance, ILS, you know, sometimes the weather is so bad, category 3 ILS, the plane can pretty much auto land by itself. So these guys are the one that ensure that these equipment are ready and fit. So when these aircraft are operating, there is no mismatch. Because you do not want aircraft landing in category 3. Pilot cannot see, it's on autopilot landing, and it's pretty much off. You know, you don't want it to come and lick the tower and lick the terminal building. It pretty much should be on the runway center line. So salute to all the air traffic engineers out there. Love and respect. Annex 11, my pet peeve area, air traffic services. Now, in 1944, when the Chicago Convention started out, there was nothing known as air traffic control. People fly around their plane because there wasn't many planes. But now the skies are congested and tight, yes? And air traffic controllers are like skillful footballers, yes? You have to sort of have those skill set to set those planes right. And if a pilot mess up, you send him around in the penalty box and you put, believe you me, air traffic services, air traffic control service, flight information service, alerting service, we all provide all these services. You know, alerting service mean like search and rescue. If an aircraft is having an emergency, we alert the rescue and coordination crew to ensure that they're on standby. Or if something should go wrong in terms of the worst, they are there to handle that situation. So Annex 11 is about air traffic services. 12 talk about search and rescue. I was touching on that a while ago. So we talk about like pretty much every airport have like a fire station, airport fire station, and big airports have specialized fire station in terms of they have to have certain category of firefighting capability, meaning that the functional system in terms of the amount of human that they have there that are trained as firefighters in the worst event, who can handle situation in terms of their equipment, in terms of their training and procedure, has to meet a particular standard. So for instance, like the Boeing 777, yes, the firefighting capacity have to be like what, category 9? Yes. You know, there's a matrix how they work it out, but I'm not going to get into that. I'll get into that when I publish the book. Look out for it. Annex 13 talk about aircraft accident and incident investigation. Now, persons may say, okay, after aircraft crash, why you want to get into the investigation part of it? Well, the bottom line is that whenever there is an incident or an accident, it is properly investigated. There is something which is known as just culture. So it is investigated not necessarily to blame people, but to learn from that situation. And then that situation can be applied to other areas, because sometimes there can be mistakes, or sometimes there can be weak procedures that need to strengthen, and that sometimes comes out of the investigation, and that's why there is a standardized way to have investigations carried out. So for instance, that airline that crashed in Ethiopia, we had those Boeing 737, those stretch Boeing 738 that came out and they were giving trouble. You know, those investigations really goes to show that it was a computer issue when it come on to Boeing and their aircraft. And Boeing really actually take a big hit for that. But investigation is good because it goes in line with safety. Annex 14 talk about aerodromes. Aerodromes is pretty much an airport, and we have different types of aerodromes in terms of big aerodromes, small aerodromes, and they pretty much talk about aerodrome design as to whether it's on a hill and how you put in the procedures and everything. I'm not gonna get into the technical part of that. You can go and read Annex 14 for yourself. Annex 15 talk about aeronautical information services. Now, one of the things that pilots going to different airports around the world, they pretty much want information in terms of the equipment, the facility, the weather, all different sort of stuff. Charts and aeronautical information services are the persons who provide this the information readily accessible to pilots moving from point A to point B. And most of the time, this information as well is published online. So most countries have what is called a AIP, which is called the Aeronautical Information Publication. This is free online. You can read up on John F. Kennedy Airport or Sydney Airport or the airport in Kingston, Jamaica or Gatwick. So aeronautical information is talk about in Annex 15. Annex 16 talk about environmental protection. Now, I know that here in the UK, a lot of persons, are aware. There's this awareness about environmental protection. And I support these environmental groups because as much as we all want to live as modern beings, we have to pay attention in terms of when we move forward with development, how much we are hurting ourselves and hurting the environment. So we have to be aware of this environmental protection. So for instance, in the winters when the time is cold, yes, in terms of the aircraft operating, many of these aircraft before they move, they are frozen in ice. The parts just cannot move. And what happened is that we normally have persons who use certain types of chemical to, put on the aircraft, which really lower the freezing point of the water. Yes. And many of these chemicals, they have negative environmental impact, and we use these things by the tons. Yes. So how do we manage all of that? Many of these big fancy aircraft, many of you may fly across the Atlantic, you go to the toilet, use the toilet, flush it, it goes somewhere. It don't go out in the air. No, don't say that. It don't go out that is so wrong. When all these waste come, how it is really and truly disposed of. So all of these things are talked about in Annex 16, environmental protection. Annex 17 talk about security, safeguarding international civil aviation against acts of unlawful interference. Now, that is more than a mouthful. Everybody talk about 9/11. Yeah, I'm a dinosaur. I remember 9/11 like I'm talking to you now. But for all the Gen Zs and the millennials, they may not remember 9/11. I remember at 9/11, I was a young controller, not long before I got my license. And I worked the night shift. And I came home. I had this good neighbor. And I went home and, talked to her, about to jump in my bed. And she came and she knocked me up. Zap, 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 zap. Oh, an aircraft just crashed in a building. I went out and I talked. God, this neighbor is so sweet. I was so tired, but I went to talk to her. And in my mind, I said, oh, just some students flying, get out of control. I talked with her, went back to my bed. And then a few minutes later, she come again. I said, zap, zap, zap. Another aircraft crashed into a building. I said, what is she talking about? Anyway, because she's so sweet, talk with her, went back inside and I went to sleep because I was tired, worked the night shift. And then when I wake up in the evening and turn on the TV, the world was changed. The world was changed. Yes, because that was 9/11. It was horrible. It had a global impact. Yes, we talk about the global governance of aviation. That 9/11 had that global impact. I tell you something. Back then, I used to fly free, like on American Airlines. So sometimes when I leave my night shift and have my days off, I'll just run downstairs with my passport. I wouldn't pay anything and show my passport. And if the flight was full, I went into the cockpit and I put on my headphones. And with the pilots, when we coming into approach, we say, okay, there's the aircraft for follow number 2, and that was really, really cool. And that September in 9/11, I took a trip from Jamaica up to New York. And when I reached New York, my word, John F. Kennedy Airport, there were soldiers everywhere with big guns. I was frightened. I was like, wow, what is this? To myself, back then I was in my 20s. I was saying, My gosh. Then suppose a terrorist is going through the airport now. All of these soldiers are just going to take off. They're going to, everybody would be dead. It was just, the world changed. And one other thing is that I have something to say to the terrorists. Terrorists, because of that, I have to start paying for my ticket now. I can't fly free again because, those were the days I used to fly free in the cockpit, 747 and 737. I put on my suit, show off, flying free. That doesn't exist anymore. So security, unlawful interference is something, serious when it comes on to um, international governance and when it comes on to aviation law. Annex 18 talk about the safe transportation of dangerous goods. Now, a lot of persons don't know this. They see on the road a lot of lorries, a lot of trailers pulling around goods. A lot of the goods that the world use travel via airport. And some of those goods are dangerous goods, toxins and chemicals and corrosive and nuclear materials. Yes. And sometimes they fly through different countries. Yes. And if there's like an incident or accident, it can have devastating consequence. So for instance, if there is a country, transporting nuclear material, yes, from one place to the other, and there's a collision on the sky, wow, that collision can really poison a city. So it's pretty much serious. A lot of the public don't know about it because this thing is pretty much carried out, yeah, in the disguise of, but it is real. All right. Annex 19, and that is the annex that I want to talk about in this seminar and session of aviation law, because through all the annexes from Annex 1 all the way through to Annex 19, there is a golden thread. And the golden thread is safety. And that's why aviation is considered the safest mode of transport. Yes, they normally say it is much safer to fly in a plane than to walk across the street or just to walk down the road. It is safer than driving, riding a bicycle. It is safer than horseback riding. The safest mode of transport is travel via aviation. And the reason being is because of the safety management systems that are in place, the golden thread of safety that run through all the annexes. Now, I want to take this time out to dive into safety management systems and explain to you why global aviation is able to keep itself so safe. So see you in the next chapter as we talk about safety management systems.